The ultimate guide to epic fantasy. Now, there are countless of genres in fantasy, and it can be very hard to understand where to start. So today I'm going to give you an overview of, I think it was 15 subgenres, just to give you an understanding of what they mean and which ones you should check out in each subgenre. But to be able to fully give you an idea of epic fantasy, we need to change settings. Okay, we had to change settings, and I had to go to my computer because explaining all the different subgenres of epic fantasy can be quite a complex task. And obviously, I'm not going to be able to cover all the subgenres because when I made research for this video, there were literally more than 100 different subgenres according to various blogs and websites. Well, let's cover some of the big ones, shall we? But firstly, what is epic fantasy? Well, I will use this definition of epic fantasy, and I know some of you will disagree with it because you could probably write like 10 different essays about what it really means that a book is epic, but I will use this definition. Epic fantasy is a subgenre of fantasy literature that uses a fantasy setting or a secondary world to tell a story, okay? So a fantasy setting or a secondary world. So I know that's a very broad definition, but that's the one we're using. Now, when we are talking about epic fantasy, we have to start with the obvious one, traditional fantasy. Now, typically a lot of traditional fantasy is usually set in a medieval setting. It has a quest, it has a coming of age story or a magic school, and probably the most well-known traditional fantasy is Lord of the Rings, obviously. But related to traditional fantasy, we have lots of other subgenres. Now, the first one I think it's worth mentioning is quest fantasy. Now, what is quest fantasy? Well, in quest fantasies, a quest is usually central to the plot of these novels, as a character is set out on an epic journey to achieve a specific goal, which might be saving the world, finding a lost artifact, or seeking redemption. Now, there are a lot of quest fantasies out there, but a couple of really well-known examples include The Hobbit and The Dark Tower. I mean, obviously The Hobbit, we see Bilbo going on this massive quest, and then we have the Gunslinger in The Dark Tower, which is one of my favorite series, where the protagonist Roland is haunted by the Dark Tower and is absolutely driven to reach the Dark Tower. It is such a good series. But also related to traditional fantasy, we have another really well-known subgenre that is also in other subgenres of epic fantasy, but that is having a magic school. Now, Harry Potter definitely popularized the magic school setting, but these stories usually take place within magical schools or academics where typically young students learn how to harness their magical abilities, and I am a huge sucker for a magical school. Some books that have the magical school setting include A Wizard of Earthsea, an absolute classic, and in more recent times, and I actually haven't read this book yet, but that is The Will of the Many by James Islington. I've heard that this book is an incredible book that features a magic school, or at least a school setting. So here at least you have two recommendations, either if you want to go with something more traditional, or if you want to try something a bit more modern. But I know The Will of Many isn't technically traditional fantasy, but it is a magic school. Now, another subgenre on the traditional fantasy that again is also in a lot of other subgenres, but is one of my favorite as well, which is coming of age fantasy. I love this genre so much. A coming of age fantasy typically features a young protagonist. Coming of age usually follows this young protagonist's journey of self-discovery and growth, as they usually face a lot of challenges, and through these challenges they often uncover their identities. And if a fantasy book has a good coming of age story, then I will usually be all over that. Now again, a lot of other subgenres that aren't traditional also have coming of age, but it's definitely something that's often seen in traditional fantasy. And there's so many books that have this trope, but they include 3 different books: Lord of the Rings, The Name of the Wind, and Assassin's Apprentice. For example, if you take Assassin's Apprentice, which is set in a medieval setting, we have this young protagonist that is really struggling and is being thrown into this complex situation and has to overcome so many challenges. But throughout this whole trilogy, we really get to see Fitz, the protagonist of Assassin's Apprentice, grow and overcome and also fail at a lot of challenges. So I am a huge sucker of coming of age, and it's definitely something you should be looking out for if you're new to epic fantasy. But there's so many other subgenres than just traditional fantasy, so let's move on to the next one, shall we? The next one I had to include was Grimdark fantasy, which is without a doubt one of the most popular subgenres of epic fantasy in recent times. I mean, there's so many classics there, but usually when I think about Grimdark, I think about either the First Law or the Broken Empire. Now, I wasn't a huge fan of the Broken Empire, but that was definitely Grimdark. Well, I think that the Blade itself and the First Law universe, if you're looking for a Grimdark epic fantasy, then this is definitely the place to go, because Abercrombie, he just knows how to write characters, and albeit it's grim, Abercrombie also also knows how to sprinkle a bit of humor into this novel to make them a bit more lighthearted, which I really appreciate. Now, related to Grimdark Fantasy, we have another subgenre called Dark Fantasy. Now, Dark Fantasy is usually a subgenre that is very dark, very cynical, and often doesn't have almost any hope. Like, everything's just quite dark, depressing, but it usually handles with some really, really deep themes. So if you want something that is even darker than Grimdark, then check out Dark Fantasy. And as I said, I'm not a huge fan of Dark Fantasy, but a couple of books that I will probably class in that genre includes The Darkness That Comes Before by R. Scott Baker. Now, I haven't read this book, but I've heard it's very, very dark. And then I've also added Gunmetal Gods, which I know some people will say is Grimdark and not Dark Fantasy. And I actually didn't even finish that book, but I read around half of it, and I found it to be very, very dark. So that's why I've also added it to the Dark Fantasy subgenre. But another subgenre that is often related to Grimdark, not always, but often, is military fantasy. Now, what is military fantasy? Usually military fantasy have stories that revolve around armies, warfare, and strategic battles in a fantasy setting. Now, the plot may follow a military campaign, or the rise of a warrior, or the struggles of soldier. Now, this is also a subgenre that I haven't been able to fully enjoy that much, because usually I find it quite dry and it isn't that character driven usually. But if you want to check out some well-known military fantasies, then two absolute classics in this subgenre include Guardians of the Moon, the first book in Melassan, and especially I think Deadhouse Gates, which is book 2, is very military fantasy driven. And then we also have The Black Company by Glenn Cook, which is arguably the most iconic or well-known military fantasy. So usually these are also quite dark, they're maybe quite dry, but they definitely revolve around militaries and soldiers and so on. So those two are great suggestions if you want to get into military fantasy. Alright, but now let's move away from grimdark fantasy and focus on something that is usually at least a bit more lighthearted than urban fantasy, but it doesn't have to be, and that is urban fantasy. Now, what is urban fantasy? Well, urban fantasy is usually set in a modern urban environment. So now urban fantasy usually mixes magical elements with the real world, and it often involves supernatural creatures living in secret among humans, or is just set in a modern setting. Now, this is a subgenre that I haven't read that much of, but there's two examples of urban fantasies that are great recommendations. First, we have Jade City by Fonda Lee. The Greenbone Saga is one of, if not my all-time favorite series, an absolute brilliant series that is set in a world that is inspired by modern Asia. So that is definitely a beautiful modern urban fantasy, but probably one of the most iconic urban fantasies of our times is The Dresden Files by Jim Butcher. I think there's 16 or 17 books in that one. Both of these are great recommendations if you want to check out urban fantasy. Now, a subgenre related to urban fantasy is portal fantasy. Now again, portal fantasy is an absolute classic in the fantasy genre, and in these stories, usually the protagonist is transported from our real world to a fantastical world, and usually our protagonist or a group of people, they embark on a grand adventure in this new world. And there are some absolute classics when it comes to portal fantasy. For example, we have Narnia by C.S. Lewis, and we have Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Both are fantasies where a protagonist goes from our world and is transported into another world. Now, for some reason, portal fantasy doesn't seem to be that popular anymore. Like now, mostly books will be either fully set in our world or they will be fully set in a fantastical setting, while portal fantasy kind of blends both of them. I mean, usually our world isn't that important in the story, and most of the story will take place in the magical world, but it's still very fun because usually we can very much relate to these characters because they come from our world. Now, another subgenre that is kind of related to urban fantasy is steampunk fantasy, and this is a genre I haven't read that much of, but whenever I encounter it, I love it. Now, steampunk fantasy usually blends elements of fantasy and technology. So steampunk fantasy is often set in a Victorian era-like world, but not always, where steam-powered machinery and magic coexist. And I just love that exploration of having magic in a more modern world. Because one thing that often blows my mind, and it just doesn't make any sense, is why do most fantasy worlds never progress? Like, why are they stuck in an age where technology is never like progressed and so on? It just doesn't really make any sense. But whenever fantasy authors do choose to explore having magic and technology coexist, I just find it so fascinating because it creates some really interesting dynamics. Now, I have 3 recommendations for you if you want to get into steampunk fantasy. We have The Books of Babel by Josiah Bancroft, we have the Age of Madness trilogy here by Joe Abercrombie, and again, as you can see, Gunmetal Gods, which was also in the dark fantasy genre. All of these three books have magic or at least fantastical elements, but they also do have like steampunk inventions, and especially Age of Madness here by Joe Abercrombie, which you kind of have to read the other books first before you get to it, is so good, because the first universe is set in a more medieval kind of setting, but in the Age of Madness we see the world progress and these steampunk inventions start to pop up while we're reading the stories, and it literally changes society. So I think the Age of Madness is probably my favorite steampunk fantasy I've ever read, but as I said, you kind of have to read like 3 or 4 other books before you can read it. Now the last big genre I want to cover, and I know there's so many other out there, but that is mythological fantasy. Now I have to admit that this is a subgenre I have read very little from, but my wife actually really loves mythological fantasy and she rates it very highly. But what is mythological fantasy? Well, mythological fantasy is usually inspired by various mythologies and folklore from different cultures. Mythological fantasy usually weaves ancient tales and gods into new and captivating narratives. Now, mythological fantasy is also a genre that has become incredibly popular in the last decade, and probably 2 books that you probably heard about that are very well known when it comes to mythological fantasy include Song of Achilles and Circe by Madeline Miller. Now, my wife has read Circe and she loved it. She hasn't read Song of Achilles yet, but if you've been on TikTok or Bookstagram or anywhere, you will have seen this book so much. But the last subgenre I want to cover that is obviously related to mythological fantasy is fairy tale retellings. Now, this one is quite obvious what it is, but the definition of a fairy tale retelling is that these stories usually reimagine classic fairy tales with fresh twists, new characters, or have alternative settings that make them appealing both to children and adults. Again, fairy tale retellings isn't a subgenre I have read that much of, but it's definitely, again, a subgenre my wife has read a bit of and she really enjoys. And 2 well-known books in the fairy tale retelling subgenre include The Bear and the Nightingale by Catherine Ardeen, and my wife has actually just finished the whole trilogy and she loved it because she just loved hearing about the Russian folklore and so on. And then we also have Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik, a standalone that I literally own. I've owned the book for 2 years and I don't know why I haven't picked it up yet, but hopefully I will soon. But here you have an introductory guide to epic fantasy, and one thing I hope has become clear to you as you watch this video is that there is a lot of overlap between these different genres. For example, I added Age of Madness to the steampunk here, but I could also have easily added it to the Grimdark genre over here. So usually all fantasy books that they usually have more than one subgenre in them. There might be a coming of age element and a military fantasy element, for example, in one book, and so on, which is also the reason why there's often so many discussions about subgenres and what is the definition of epic fantasy and urban fantasy and so on. And even in this guide, I might have made a couple of mistakes because the definitions of where books belong and so on is just so challenging often to narrow down. But hopefully you have found this helpful and enjoyed this video, which is quite different from stuff I usually make. Thank you so much for watching.
Hey guys, thank you so much for watching this video all the way to the end. I hope you enjoyed this video and got some inspiration to read more books. Now, if you want to support me in any way, then you can check out my Patreon. I have different tiers and you'll get different benefits depending on what tier you support. Some of the benefits include getting your name in my videos, voting rights on my next feed, getting a special role on my Discord server, getting access to one Patreon exclusive video a month, or even art cards and bookmarks signed by my wife and me. Most of the money goes to hiring an editor to do a couple of videos for me a month, which basically allows me to post high quality content more frequently. But yeah, thank you so much for watching and God bless.